This video lecture is about the anatomy, subtitle The Genre That Ate the World, or Why Moby Dick Isn't a Novel. So, Moby Dick is not a novel, it is a genre called the anatomy. And when you think of what an anatomy is, your mind might go to physical performance and representation. Here you see some historical paintings of anatomy lessons given by doctors to medical school students. This was a popular genre of painting. Anatomy immediately brings to mind the medical term for dissection of a body, the actual physical performance of an anatomy, and perhaps the descriptive anatomy of textbooks or the large anatomy textbook that you might see some students lugging around. The action of performing an anatomy and the representation of anatomy in a textbook, both of those inform the literary genre of an anatomy. I will call the anatomy genre the cutter's art. And it's the cutter's art because the anatomist believes that the body and its structures can be understood through dissection, that one must cut the body to know knowledge, and paradoxically, cutting is done in order to make a whole. So you cut something in order to make something unified. The something unified is the text that results from the cutting. So dissection or cutting is done in order to classify and gain knowledge, to relate the parts to the whole, to gain more and more detail and more knowledge. And paradoxically, again, the whole is known by taking it apart, taking the body apart. So theoretically, the more a researcher understands parts, maybe organs in a body, the more the researcher understands the entirety. Creating a medical anatomy necessitates excavating the body in order to create an organizational schema of the parts, whether on the surface or at depth. The anatomist cuts and constructs, dismantling and reconstructing. So we have dissection and description that are used towards a body of knowledge. You see here on the left a famous image from Juan Valverde de Amusco's 1559 anatomy book. It is a body holding its own skin. This is an allegorical pose. I do apologize, it's a little bit on the blurry side, but you can get the point of it. I also think it's interesting that the figure is holding the knife used to take the skin off the body. More recently, in 2014, there was a traveling exhibit called The Body of Knowledge that actually showed artfully anatomized actual human bodies that had been preserved. These traveled in an art installation to various universities around the country. The idea of anatomizing and dissecting and classifying in order to represent all of those things are related to medical anatomy, but also the anatomy genre. In fact, when we are considering how we talk about texts, like textuality, books, papers, even digital texts, we often use body metaphors. The word digital actually comes from digits or fingers. The word corpora means bodies, or a body. It's actually a term used in printing. It's not used as much anymore, but the word corpora was often used for bodies of text, like having a set of books was a corpora. We have headers and footers at the tops and bottoms of documents that we type. We also have the word interface. So we have face there for surface, even the word face is in the word surface, or the screen for digital text. So the the words associated with the body and with digital text and other texts, these things are interrelated. Now I'm going to take a little bit of a turn here. but it'll make sense as I keep building in this elusive sort of way towards what this anatomy genre is. You're looking here at images of what were called cabinets of curiosity. And cabinets of curiosity are collections that it was mostly wealthy white men in the West who had these types of things where they'd have like little boxes, cabinets. This one looks like an Oriental style curio cabinet on the right. This is a cabinet that actually ended up turning into a room. So you'll have these educated gentlemen collecting objects from around the world, including skulls, bones, pottery, shards. You'll actually see that bones feature in all of these. Various artifacts, little pieces of art, scientific instruments, those kinds of things were placed in these cabinets that functioned like miniature archives. The importance of this is the step towards collecting information. So you can make a move from collecting by dissecting, gathering, and then displaying. So you could have displays like this in cabinets or maybe a whole room, not unlike displays that happen in a removed sort of way in a text where the objects aren't so much physical as they are textual and require very much the imagination in order to make some sort of sense out of what is being seen. These cabinets of curiosities led directly to the birth of archives and museums. This is an image of a man named Charles Willson Peale. He had the first museum in America. He's pictured here lifting the curtain. He's part of the scene that's very important as the museum curator, director, archivist. You see mastodon bones here and here in early America. So this is 18th century, Age of Reason fits right there with Benjamin Franklin and Villot. And here you have Charles Willson Peale foregrounded in front of his collection behind him with visitors who've come to see things in this early museum in America with, on a much larger scale than what you saw here, items displayed for the public. These kinds of collections are still in museums, but they're also in our archives, which are often the behind the scenes parts of museums and also libraries. This passage, I have the citation for it below, but I like how it pulls together some of what I've been talking about here. The archive resists knowledge in a number of ways. It refuses closure. Often it simply refuses any answer at all. It prompts us, as contending scholars, to resist early resolution of questions that should not be too quickly answered. Archives or collections of objects resist knowledge, refuse closure, make us keep asking questions. In other words, there's something to be valued about just the collection, the gathering, and the display. And maybe there aren't necessarily going to always be answers to what we're supposed to feel or put together from an archive, a museum, a collection, a cabinet of curiosities, a book that is the anatomy genre, for instance. So, the anatomy genre, well, what is this thing? It is encyclopedic, it includes the dissection of knowledge and accumulation of information, amassing of facts, proliferating lists, and absolute elaborate detail. It is a genre that involves expanding information. Now it's probably starting to sound more like Moby Dick. Still not the easiest thing to define. Well, why is that? It eludes classification because it is comprised of mixed genres. It is digressive, unstable, paradoxical, with tension between containment and expansion. In other words, parts of an anatomy book are going to seem as though you're contained and under control, and then all of a sudden it's going in all these different directions and expanding on these different tangents. An anatomy is experimental, it is discursive, so it basically talks back to itself. It's self reflexive. The anatomist or author is part of the anatomy, so there's a performance based aspect to it, not unlike Charles Wilson Peel here. Ishmael is like that. Ishmael is very much like Peel in this pose. Well, not to be cute here, but peeling back the curtain, right? Showing us all of this knowledge that he's collected. And anatomy genres are often romantic, maybe even utopian. I have this little rhizome image at the bottom because one of the metaphors I think is useful for understanding this genre is to think about a little plant that comes up above the surface of the soil, and underneath it, rhizomes that spread out, the roots that go underneath the soil, spreading prolifically often in a garden, and new plants are coming up all over the place. And if you pull up that large mother plant, well, you're not necessarily going to get much of the rest of what's shooting off of it and being created. That's not unlike what happens with the anatomy genre. So, as I mentioned a few moments ago with Charles Wilson Peel lifting the curtain and how that is much like Ishmael, the anatomy genre is always self aware. It's even circular and tautological, not unlike the Ouroboros or a snake eating its own tail. It is digressive, often mixes genres such as prose and verse. It may have images in it. You don't have much of that in Moby Dick. Maybe there's a play here and there, like some dramatic instances, like we've seen in Moby Dick, or chapters on whale anatomy, behavior, and even types of whales. There's a part of Moby Dick I didn't assign, and it's a couple of pages at the very beginning, and it's called Etymologies and Extracts. And etymologies, it's word origins. And on those pages, there are a number of definitions of whales that Ishmael provides at the beginning of the book before he actually starts with that famous opening line, "Call me Ishmael." He also has extracts there. And he has this little note here in parentheses, supplied by a sub librarian. Now, I feel as though this blurb truly supports the idea of considering the book Moby Dick as an anatomy, and no other genre really will do, because it checks all the boxes of these characteristics that I went over. What the anatomy actually is, it's encyclopedic, it's digressive, it's maximalist, it is all sorts of detail crammed together, hard to understand. And here's what Ishmael says in his own words, supplied by a sub librarian. Well, that's Ishmael. And remember that archives are parts of libraries. So that's how we get connected back to the text. It will be seen that this mere painstaking burrower and grub worm of a poor devil of a he's talking about himself, sub librarian, appears to have gone through the long Vaticans and street stalls of the earth like winding corridors, and imagine little, rooms and cubbies and things, picking up whatever random allusions to whales he could anyways find in any book whatsoever, sacred or profane, the gathering of knowledge. Therefore, you must not in every case at least take the higgledy-piggledy whale statements, however authentic in these extracts, for veritable gospel cetology. In other words, I'm going to throw all these things at you, but you can't say it's 100% correct. So there's humor here too. Far from it. As touching the ancient authors generally, as well as the poets here appearing, these extracts are solely valuable or entertaining as affording a glancing bird's eye view of what has been promiscuously said, thought, fancied, and sung of Leviathan by many nations and generations, including our own. In other words, it's like a disclaimer. He's saying, oh, I got all these ideas about whales and I picked them up all over the place. And then he says, so fare thee well. Goodbye, poor devil of a whose commentator I am. Thou belongest to that hopeless, sallow tribe which no wine of this world will ever warm. and for whom even pale sherry would be too rosy strong, but within whom one sometimes loves to sit and feel poor devilish too. In other words, like the the librarian, sub librarian, is really no fun at all. He is a sort of unfortunate kind of fellow. Nobody would want to hang out with him. He's interested in just gathering his knowledge. We need to say goodbye to him, but he's also saying it about himself. And then we also know Moby Dick starts with that line, "Call me Ishmael." It's not even his name. So he, from this beginning that I didn't ask you to read, he makes himself maybe not so trustworthy. And the ironic aspect of the anatomy, the irony of it, is an important piece of understanding Moby Dick. Ishmael refers to himself quite a lot in the book and to readers. In the chapter Cetology, that whole chapter is books as whales or whales as books, types of books. Duodecimo, all these different terms. Those had to do with the sizes of paper that books were printed on. And so he gives us books actually as whales in order to anatomize the whale and, well, books themselves. There are genres, I meant to say anatomies here. Anatomies other than Moby Dick, here's a collection on this page. Let me fix that. If you were just wondering, are there other anatomies out there? There are, and this is just a small collection of them. When you're reading Moby Dick and you get frustrated and the digressions happen and Ishmael is trying to be funny and sometimes he really is and sometimes you just want to roll your eyes or maybe run away, know that that's all deliberate and your reaction to it is understandable. And if you know it's deliberate and he is being ironic and he is being, I don't know, exhausting in the way he details knowledge, you can say, oh, there he goes again. He's making the anatomy.